We are one, a diverse group of proudly kindred spirits, here not by coincidence, but because we choose to journey together. We are active and proactive. We care deeply. We live our love as best we can. We are one, working, eating, laughing, playing, singing, storytelling, sharing, and rejoicing, getting to know each other, taking risks, opening up, questioning, seeking, searching, trying to understand, struggling, making mistakes, paying attention, asking questions, listening, living our answers, learning to love our neighbors, learning to love ourselves, apologizing and forgiving with humility, and being forgiven through grace, creating the beloved community together. We are one.
Is it hard being a kid sometimes? Yeah. Well, here's something you might forget. All of these grown-ups in the room, we were once kids too. And some of us found some things hard or frustrating or even a little disheartening sometimes. Sometimes you kind of have this type of day. Sometimes you have like, some days you have kind of this day. And sometimes it's about who you're in relationship with, right? Adults, does that still happen to you now as grown-ups? Sometimes even now things happen to you and it kind of brings you back to when you were maybe this age. And you suddenly feel maybe like you were in the principal's office again, or, maybe, in a timeout, or any of those sort of things, are in like middle school when there's just weird cliques and kind of suddenly not feeling like you belong. That's a hard thing to do. But when we have community, we find ways to heal through that. So let me see. I have some things in my Wonderbox. I have two things. Let's see. Okay, you want to come? You just grab one thing. Okay, be really careful. It's heavy. Hold on to that for me for a second. Okay. What is that? A hammer. Okay. All right. You can go ahead and sit down. Anybody ever remember being told to sit up straight, and children are to be seen and not heard, and that there's a this way or that way to do things? You might have felt like a nail kind of being hammered into the way you're supposed to be, or maybe you wanted to be all curvy and wonderful, and they were kind of like flattening you or straightening you out. It didn't feel very good, did it? No. Okay, let's see. What else? You want to come see what the other thing in there is? Oh, this could seem helpful. A ruler, right? Good for making straight lines, knowing when things are flush, but also kind of can box you in, right? I'm a person who very much loves to think out of the box. And so feeling like I have to be straight and narrow, maybe I want to be wild and crazy, you don't want to diminish that. So those are things that kind of are an example of power over, right? So maybe someone telling you all those things. And when you hear all those things incessantly, right? That anybody ever heard the Charlie Brown teacher? It kind of can sound like that when they're telling you, don't do this and don't do that and be this and be that. Do you ever feel that way? Yeah. Does it make you want to be there? When there's like either or thinking and only certain people get to be in charge? Do you see that other places? Sometimes it could happen at home. It could happen at school. It could even happen at churches. It can also happen in our government and our leaders a lot, right? So what if there's a different way to do it? Has anybody ever heard of power with something? Have you heard of that idea ever? Okay, I might need a friend to help me. You want to come help me? Okay, come here. Come stand here next to me because you're tall and people can see you. I want you to put this on your pointer finger of each finger. Like you're going to do cat's cradle. There you go. Okay, so For those who can't see, I gave our friend a rubber band. Okay, rubber bands help us remember to be flexible, right? Now, if you get too close together, it kind of will relax, and we need that sometimes to take a breath from feeling pulled to each end. But sometimes a healthy tension, you want to pull them apart, a healthy tension kind of helps hold things together, right? So it doesn't just slip off. Now, if you pulled those fingers super, super far apart, you don't have to, what could happen?
It could break.
It could break. It could snap and fly off, right? So it's really important to have just the right balance of power with something, right? And making sure we're in covenant and we're asking along the way, hey, how does that feel? Does that feel okay on your finger like that? Okay, if I went ahead and pulled it like this, you might say what? Can I grab one? Okay, all right. Oop, hold on, don't lose it. If I was doing this, what might you say? And I would say, I'm sorry. Let's find a way that feels comfortable for both of us. Thank you. You want to go down there? Okay, now the other thing about power with is this idea that power isn't finite, right? So power can grow the more we share it. So, do you want to help me lift this up here? So, some of you might have been here for Thanksgiving service or our gratitude service and remember this. Thank you. What is this? Weaving, right? And so when you weave things, you go ahead and you kind of think about, how am I doing this? You have to be mindful of it. Every step along the way, you have to go over and under. And you know what? If you mess up along the way, you just undo it and start over. But then we can also kind of move things down and make room for new people. And the more this gets compacted together and the more we make space for new people, what happens to the weaving? It gets stronger. Does it get stronger? And sometimes more beautiful, the more we expand the community. Look at all the colors in there. I see words like patience and hope for the future. When we weave our intentions together and we expand who we are including and sharing our power with, we can create something beautiful that grows and grows. Thank you to all my helpers today. We're going to go ahead and sing you out to your classes. So to youth group or with me and Brittany to create holiday sweaters.
I'm thinking a lot recently about the expression on the side of love, which we use regularly and rather casually to express, I believe, our solidarity with marginalized people in our society. Although the word love is often used in the public arena, expressions like love more, love wins, make love, not war, love is more powerful than hate, etc., I find that the concept of love, this unromantic yet strong and open and filled with empathy and compassion love, is actually more difficult to achieve than one would think. To be open to all, show empathy for all, and be willing to accept all as equals is what I have concluded is really the meaning of this use of the word love. It is not easy and it takes intention. Our society currently worldwide is struggling with this notion, and it is causing a lot of friction and even hostility and violence. I'm often horrified by the lack of love that is shown between humans in our world. And I realize after much pondering that being someone that firmly believes in the power of love, I have to work harder at putting it out there. As I have been pondering these ideas, I have also been listening to the voices of older women and women who have not historically been heard in our societies. I feel so strongly that part of the friction and hostility that is manifesting in the world has to do with how uncomfortable the people who've always been the powerful ones, who've called all the shots, made the money, and pushed their agendas, are so threatened by the idea of women, young people, people of color, immigrants, LGBTQ folks, people of varying abilities, etc., and so on, getting any power, that it literally makes them act terribly towards other people. Why now, in this era, in 2023, are we still talking about, fighting about, lifting up, and learning about how important it is to move over and give others power and agency, in order to right the wrongs that have occurred historically, and to move closer to what we supposedly hope for, a more just and equitable society. It actually makes my head spin, as it is both complex and simple and not easy to face. I realized recently that having grown up in a certain era raised by people of a certain other era, most women my age and older have not had the power to be themselves completely, to ask for what they want, be treated completely respectfully, and have a voice in all the areas in which we move. Not all women want to be powerful, but all women want respect. And still in this day and age, there are many women the world over who are not being respected, are abused and mistreated, and still don't have a voice. What I've come to appreciate so much, even though I am sometimes, being a woman of a certain age, not completely comfortable as I experience their power, is how young women are fighting the power and taking their rightful place in our societies. I know so many young women who are doing what they want to do, being who they want to be, making change, challenging the status quo, and teaching us, the older generation and those steeped in the patriarchy, that they have the power now. It makes me feel so joyful, even when I'm uncomfortable, whether they are entertainers, artists, lawyers, doctors, human rights activists, politicians, teachers, or truck drivers, or anything. The young women are shaking up the world. And honestly, it's about time. And it's just one example of people who have not had power really coming into it with a force to be reckoned with. My true hope is that our world will continue to see that in order to be a truly just and equitable society, all the people who have been on the margins have to be welcomed into the world of power. This is truly what it means to love everyone. It will not go smoothly, and it will not happen overnight, as we know, but it will happen. And I, for one, am happy about that. This reading is an excerpt from the 203rd annual Berry Street essay titled My Little Pony Was Right, Reflections of Fascisms Within and Without by Reverend Cecilia Kingman. Unitarian Universalism is currently in a moment of major theological transformation and institutional reform. This transition is causing a backlash within our congregations and among some colleagues. We are moving away from individualism to communitarian values, from white supremacy culture to truly radical liberation, from a concentration of power among historically privileged groups and towards a new form of power sharing. Some are responding to these shifts with anxiety and conflict. Excuse me. We have theological shifts rising up, shifts towards justice and shared power. Those who have been historically excluded are rightly insisting on liberation. This threatens the old order, which is determined to retain its power. And there are some among us who are using the language of Unitarianism and liberalism to attempt to suppress the theological shifts that are welling up. The question is, how do we dismantle the structures of power that protect historic hierarchies? It is a terrible truth that those who would cling to power are not easily interested in their own liberation. Sorry. As a recovering alcoholic, I recognize the ways power looks a lot like addiction. Indeed, I believe power and privilege are addictions, and addictions lie. How do we help people understand that what they thought was their own freedom wasn't freedom, it was power? If you have been cutting off parts of yourself to survive, you are not free. If you have been cutting off parts of yourself to gain success, wealth, relationships, prestige, and yes, even if you have been simply trying to create a pocket of safety for yourself, this is not freedom.
Reading is an excerpt from Where Do We Go From Here by the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King, Jr. One of the great problems of history is that the concepts of love and power have usually been contrasted as opposites, polar opposites, so that love is identified with a resignation of power and power with a denial of love. What is needed is a realization that power without love is reckless and abusive, and love without power is sentimental and anemic. Power at its best is love implementing the demands of justice. And justice at its best is power correcting everything that stands against love. And this is what we must see as we move on. I'd like to begin this sermon by thanking Stephen Barnard, who was the highest bidder, along with Heather, for the sermon topic of your choice that I offered up at the auction this past August. He and I met a few times to talk about his interests in the themes of power and powerlessness, and they were meaningful and stimulating conversations. And I have to admit, there were times I was getting a little nervous in the past few weeks about whether I would be able to handle and fit such a complex topics into a single sermon. Stephen gave me a book to help in my preparations. Thanks. It's called Power and the Powerless, written by Michael Parenti, which was published in 1978. Parenti, who is still alive at the age of 90, living in New York City, was a professor at the University of Vermont. Such a liberal bastion. Due to his political views, he left after just a few years to devote himself to full-time writing and speaking, which he has done for the past half century. For all intents and purposes, Michael Parenti is a leading writer and intellectual within the American left. He is rooted in the Marxist school of thought and political science. So now we know where Stephen sits on the political spectrum. No, but in all seriousness, I found so much of Parenti's scholarship to be relevant to the challenges we face today in society and within Unitarian Universalism. While his most famous work is Democracy for the Few, which is a wide-ranging analysis of the United States economic and political systems, a book used in many college courses across the country, Power and the Powerless offers a more narrow reflection on the fundamental topic that flows throughout all of his scholarship: power. Power is a pretty abstract concept, yet it has endless practical everyday uses. Parenti compares it to science in this way. Quote, power as a concept is fundamental to the analysis of political affairs in the same sense, Bertrand Russell suggests, in which energy is the fundamental concept of physics. Neither power nor energy is an object of the sensate world. Both are hypothetical constructs. One does not see or touch energy as such, but one may observe its manifestation in heat, light, motion, growth, and decay. So with power. It is a construction of the mind introduced because it is useful in describing and explaining important empirical phenomena, end quote. A little further down in the same chapter, he defines power as this: a relationship between a person and their environment. Specifically, let us say that power is the ability to get what one wants. End quote. Power, whether in politics, society, work, family, or religious community, is one's ability to get what one wants. It introduces a very human concept of interest or self-interest. We each have self-interests that shape how we use our power to a large extent. And while sometimes our interests are selfless, there is always a starting point where the interest is derived, the self. I like this notion of power in part because it acknowledges that we are discriminating creatures. We discriminate, we decide what interests us, what we want, and whether we are willing to use our power to get it. In Parenti's analysis, the United States, power is not a team sport where all win, but a cutthroat battle, a survival of the fittest, a pitting of the haves against the have-nots and the have-somes against the have-mores. You get the picture. Power and in turn our interests are meted out in an arena of competing interests. and powerful, often economic competitions. As such, we are faced to pick sides, to develop alliances, registering for a particular political party and spending our money and power on things with others that share our interests. This includes UUCCI. Can you recall what many people say when they talk about what they were looking for when they came here or what they love about UUCCI? We often say something like, I was looking for a community of like-minded people. Like-minded people. What does that mean, like-minded? Does it mean we all think about the world in the same way, or our beliefs about morality and the divine or about the afterlife or whatever happens are the same? No, not necessarily. We tend to mean something more often about our shared interests that may exist here. We might not call them interests, but we might call them a step deeper into our shared values. Here, we share our values with one another, and they are of common interest to us. At UUCCI, what attracts one to come through these doors, let alone stay in this congregation, is a sense of recognition of common interests with others, to the point that you may come to say or feel that these are my people. When we assert that Unitarian Universalism is a part of the liberal religious tradition, or that ours is a liberal religious community, there is a bit of a tension at play, like that rubber band, a struggle, truly a clash of interests. Liberal religion is not to be understood in the political sense like liberal politics. Rather, liberalism and liberal religion has to do with a central interest, namely that of freedom. Freedom is at the heart of what it means to be a religious liberal. The Unitarian Universalist Association bylaws and the proposed revision to the bylaws up for a vote this coming June continues to center such freedom. Here are the similar yet revised words proposed for this next General Assembly. Quote, Section C 2.5, following along, freedom of belief. Quote, congregational freedom and the individual's right of conscience are central to our Unitarian Universalist heritage. Congregations may establish statements of purpose, covenants, and bonds of union so long as they do not require that members adhere to a particular creed, end quote. So on the one hand, freedom is central to both the individual and congregational interests. But when we come into community where freedom is centered, we will naturally face competing self-interests as we discern what might be defined as our shared interests. Essentially, choosing to be in community is an acknowledgement that our pure freedom or complete self-interest is insufficient and unfulfilling to living a meaningful life. For centuries, Unitarianism and Universalism have been centered in the liberal religious tradition. We even have our own section in the Wikipedia article on the topic. But with this understanding of religion that centers freedom, we have inherited and continue to perpetuate a complementary understanding of power. If power is the freedom or capacity to get what one wants, then Unitarian Universalists got a whole heck of a lot of it. Dang it. A whole heck of a lot of it. In community, we have the freedom to determine for ourselves what feels right and true to each of us. And then collectively, we can decide what is our shared vision, our where, our shared mission, our why, and in turn, our shared ministry, our how, which can ensure we are embodying our mission and working to achieve our vision as a congregation. For all these questions of why we exist, of where we are going, and how we will get there, it requires power, and it requires us to understand how we will use our power to make these things. I hope this makes some sense. Well, things only get more complicated from here. You see, as our first reading indicated, there are major winds of change happening within society at large regarding power, and Unitarian Universalism is not immune to these changes. As my colleague, the Reverend Cecilia Kingman, shared this past summer in her Berry Street essay, which you can read in its entirety if you search for it online, Quote, we are moving away from individualism to communitarian values, from white supremacy culture to truly radical liberation, from a concentration of power among historically privileged groups and toward a new form of power sharing. As Adrian explored earlier, prepositions really do matter when it comes to conversations of society, religion, and politics. Power over versus power with, driving change versus shaping change, power, top-down power versus grassroots power. All of these are tensions within the shifting world of liberal and conservative religions and of democratic societies and fascist autocracies throughout the world. Kingman argues that the shift away from individual power to shared power is witnessing resistance within society and within our own congregations. And the tactics to control, stifle, and cease such change is coming in many different ways. Just as Parenti would argue that change is hard for even progressive institutions because many see the, quote, established order as synonymous with order itself, continuing, hence the overthrow of this order is feared as the end of all order, end quote. I might draw a comparison with the proposed changes to the UUA bylaws, which includes a removal of the principles and sources and replacing them with a series of values and related covenantal statements. This notion of removing the principles, which we have listed above the entrance when you come in, from the UUA bylaws, can feel like for some that it's changing Unitarian Universalism beyond recognition. But the anxiety around change in UUism is a perennial challenge for our freedom-loving folks. In every chapter of our centuries-long living tradition, we have found ways to shape language for the current and emerging day, walking a fine line between acknowledging shared interests without creeping into some sort of creed. In Kingman's essay and Liz's reflection this morning and in our proposed UUA bylaws, there's an elephant in the room making himself known: love. Did you know that the word love is nowhere to be found in any of the 7 principles of Unitarian Universalism? And yet for so many, love is of central interest to our understanding of the world, of that which we gravitate towards, and in which we hope society can be ever more rooted. Love is an inherently different centering than freedom in liberal religion. In some ways, it is a threat to freedom. Love is inviting an entirely different worldview, not of individual freedom, but of a collective vision of liberation, which is not the same as freedom. Liberation is not the same as freedom. In many respects, love can help bridge our liberal religious history, our freedom of religious belief, toward a liberating future within and beyond our UU communities. Here's how. First, Kingman challenges our central value of freedom, writing, quote, how do we help people understand that what they thought was their own freedom wasn't freedom? It was power. If you have been cutting off parts of yourself to survive, you are not free. If you have been cutting off parts of yourself to gain success, wealth, relationships, prestige, and yes, even if you have been simply trying to create a pocket of safety for yourself, this is not freedom, end quote. What I understand from this question in this passage is that our value for freedom is somewhat inextricable from our desire for individual power. There's nothing wrong with individual power, but sometimes that primary concern for individual freedom can come at the cost of empathy and concern for others within our wider community and world. As the world shifts toward more power sharing, we are invited to think about whether giving up some portion of individual freedom for the striving toward collective liberation is something we are willing to do. And whether in so doing, we come to see that the freedoms we did experience were nowhere close to the experience of collective liberation is for ours to wager. Second, Liz reflected this morning on her own relationship to love and how it is shifting and growing in prominence in her life. She shared what many of us may feel, quote, "I find that the concept of this love, unromantic yet strong and open and filled with empathy, is actually much more difficult to achieve than one would think." She says, to be open to all, show empathy to all, and be willing to accept all as equals is what I've concluded is really the meaning of this use of the word love. As I mentioned a few weeks ago, Liz is pointing to something we know deep in our hearts, that love is not just romantic and sentimental, but rather powerful and life-giving, shaping, and sustaining. If love is to be centered in our lives, our congregation, and perhaps society, we will need to understand it in this broader paradigm of the power we each have to use that love for our common interests, which leads to what Dr. King so beautifully articulated, which we shared in our second reading this morning in his famous address, "Where do we go from here?" King argues, quote, "What is needed is a realization that power without love is reckless and abusive, and love without power is sentimental and anemic. Power at its best is love implementing the demands of justice, and justice at its best is power correcting everything that stands against love." End quote. Similar to how Parenti and Kingman lifted up the existence and centrality of power in our human relationships, King can't describe love without mentioning power. And this beautiful acknowledgement that we tend to disempower love as a vulnerable and weak emotion and tool for getting what we want. But in reality, we are seeing a shift that sees love for what it truly is, namely the power we need to implement justice and correcting all those things that stand against love. Thus, the power of love goes beyond anything we could even imagine, anything we could dream or scheme. The power of love goes beyond freedom. It goes beyond freedom. Goes beyond individual interests to arrive at our collective interests in experiencing universal liberation and justice for all, including yourself. When we talk about the power of love, we are not giving away our power, we are claiming it. When we talk about the power of love, we are not getting abstract, esoteric, and poetic. We are getting real, strategic, and prepared for what is to come. The proposed UUA bylaws revisions give us such encouragement by beginning the section of our values and covenant this way. Quote, "As Unitarian Universalists, we covenant congregation to congregation and throughout our association to support and assist one another in our ministries. We draw from our heritages of freedom, reason, hope, and courage, building on the foundation of love. Love is the power that holds us together and is at the center of our shared values. We are accountable to one another for doing the work of living our shared values through the spiritual discipline of love." End quote. Friends, we are going into a time of deep anticipation of what is to come through this holiday season, in this new year, in this coming election, in the uncertain years before us in society and within these walls of UUCCI. When we imagine whether next week, month, year, or 2030, we would best bring love with us on that journey of the mind, heart, body, and soul of our community. Friends, the power of love can help us shift and build upon our rich liberal religious heritage as we acknowledge the collective work still before us. Where we are headed, where this all ends, is for us to articulate, cast, and then make real. May ours be a religion which centers love, wields power with humility, and doesn't cease till we reach that promised future. May it be so, and amen.